Welcome to, the penultimate session of this conference. It's now time to turn from the past to the future, but before we do, here is a short reminder of how things used to be in the Archive Centre. We talked about this yesterday morning. This is Claire Brown, and she was an archives assistant in the late 1970s, and this is her reflecting on her time here then.
Hello, I'm Claire, and I worked here between 1978 and 1980. I was the second archive assistant at Churchill Archives. I heard about the post here, actually at the job centre. It looked interesting and I applied, and Captain Roskin interviewed me. And all I can remember of that interview is him asking me what I thought was the value of women's education. And it was an extraordinary question, really. But I simply said I imagined that he'd educated his daughters, and he didn't follow it up. I got the job. It was new in the sense of a concept of archives, and I knew that it would be a place where I would learn. I was very definitely a college servant. I had my staff gratuity in cash in a small brown envelope at Christmas. An average day for me, as the archives assistant, was front of house reader services. There was just me. I was fetching files, I was doing any photocopying, I was reshelving material, dealing with readers. There was no conservation advice, there were no book rests, foliation, that passed through my hands and then it went up to conservation. So I was just part of a process. And it was, in a sense, a fairly industrial process. The thing which was really impressive for me was meeting so many people who had that connection with the immediate past, with great events in British history. That's the wonderful thing about working in archives. You build up your own personal jigsaw from the collections you've worked on, and they become like family friends. You feel you know them, you've read their letters, you've read their diaries. What I began here as a very naive, unqualified person has become something really special.
Okay, well, watching that, hopefully some things have changed. And we're now thinking about how they might change further going forward. Just to give a little bit of context, the Churchill Archive Centre has just invested in a digital preservation management system. We've appointed a digital archivist. We're thinking about future expansion and what our needs might be. What will preservation and access look like for the next 50 years? And to help us with our thinking, we thought it would be helpful to get some input from other professionals who are already starting to talk about and wrestle with these issues. And to chair this session, we have someone who has to think about all of this on the higher plane of university strategy. Someone you saw on screen first thing this morning, someone many of you have met in these sessions, and that's Dr. Jessica Gardner, our university librarian, a great friend of the Churchill Archive Centre and a trustee of our Sir Winston Churchill Archive Trust. Jess.
Thank you so much, Alan. And I just want to pay tribute to Claire Brown there. I think one of the wonderful things about the last couple of days has been the lives behind the scenes coming to the fore and celebrating the community within that long history of 50 years that we're all celebrating here. As Alan says, I'm a trustee of the Sir Winston Churchill Archives Trust, and it's an absolute honour to participate in any aspect of the life of the Archive Centre. And to be part of this celebration right now. I'd like to thank, as everyone has, Alan and his team, not just the work they do for the Archive Centre, but the work they do in collaboration with us at the University Library. Coming from this Saturday, Baroness Thatcher's handbag will be in prominent place in our coming exhibition on the history of spitting image. And we do try, I think, in most of our exhibitions, to do something in partnership with the Archive Centre. And, clearly, one of the things we'll touch on this session is reaching audiences. We want to make our archives as open as possible for the many who can ask questions of them and benefit. I'm joined for this panel, as Alan says, turning to the future and the challenges facing archives and the opportunities, I think, too, as things shift, by three wonderful professionals and speakers. Jessamy Carlson, who is going to be talking about public engagement, and I'll introduce each of them a little bit in turn in a moment. Mary Takayanagi, who is going to talk about the future of academic engagement and scholarship. And Chris Woods, who you can't see, but I can see on this screen, so hello Chris, is going to be coming in as our third speaker, really looking at the challenges of preservation, which are considerable. And we are going to speak as a panel, all three speakers, and then have the opportunity to open to questions. And that's partly because I think there's actually quite a lot of synergies between what we're all talking about. And we'd really love to be able to open that up into a discussion. At least two of the panelists are also historians as well as archivists. So, you know, we're all absolutely used to talking in the context of history and archives. But we're really interested as well what the challenge is for you as historians, those of you who are, and what you need from us as archives of the future. So we'd love this to be part of turning to the future of the next 50 years and onwards to the Archive Centre. Please help us to do that in discussion afterwards. So I'm really pleased that we are going to start off with Jessamy Carlson, who leads the Community and Transport team in the Collections Expertise and Engagement Department of the National Archives, and recently in 2022 led the public engagement to the release of the 1921 census, which I think is a fantastic piece. And Jessamy, I know you are also a historian, so I think we're really looking forward to hearing from you, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
I'm going to make use of the lectern. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I was very pleased and very flattered to be asked to come and give my two penneth on public engagements. So the subject of public engagement with historic collections is really multifaceted. What do we mean by public? What do we mean by engagement? And the answers for each and every archive service is going to be slightly different. So the mechanisms for engagement or interaction present a wide range of options, but I think in the first instance, there's one blocker which is critical for a number of audiences, and that's fear. I spend a lot of time talking to people about archives and research and history. I'm the principal records specialist for family, local and community history, so I am in our reading rooms on a daily basis. I am talking to people day in, day out, sometimes until I am hoarse about the history and the research that they are looking at. But there are some quite common sentiments that come up when I'm meeting people and when they find out where I work and what I do. And these can be grouped as follow. I'm not sure what I'm looking for. I didn't know I was allowed in here alongside, and I've always wondered what was in here. I don't know where to start, and I'm not a proper historian. I would like to qualify that with the fact that I'm not a proper historian either. I often joke that I have no qualifications in history, except it's a half joke because my undergraduate degree is medieval studies, which is literature, language and history. My master's degree is the professional preparation degree in archive administration, and my PhD is in sociology. So I'm not a proper historian either, but here we are, all the same. Every archivist I know, and we are a small profession, so that's a fair few of them, every archivist wants people in their archives. They want people to use their collections, to tell stories using their collections, to answer questions and solve mysteries, and just generally get a thrill out of something held in their collections, which turns out to be intriguing and interesting to them. There's a very particular squeak that you may have observed if you spend a lot of time in collections, where someone has found something that they are so thrilled about, and yet because they know it's supposed to be a quiet or a silent space, it just sort of bubbles out as a squeak, and it's one of my favourite noises in the world, like knowing that someone has found something that's just enraptured them to that point, and something that ostensibly might not look that interesting to you. Because archives without users are dead. I will fight to the death anyone who describes archives as dusty, but if collections aren't used, then they and we as archivists run the risk of being left behind. So how do we reach people? How do we, as a profession, encourage the public, whoever they may be, to engage with the archives that we hold? What does that future look like and what's key to it? And I think there are 3 key areas of practice to focus on, which are, in no particular order, meeting people where they're at, building confidence, and last but by no means least, funding. So, meeting people where they're at. This is in part about building relationships with the people around you, but also with those who your archives don't currently have a connection with. Almost every archive has some sense of who they would like to encourage to engage with their collections more, or who they might like to see better represented within their collections, and defining that strategy is really key. But it also takes time and patience to build up relationships, particularly if your long-term goal is expansion within your own collecting remit. You cannot, and you should not, expect people to deposit material that they almost certainly consider at least interesting and quite possibly precious with your service completely cold. Stakeholders and depositors for most services are to some degree stakeholders, need some kind of relationship with you and your service. And it may not need to be intensive, but in other cases you might have to work pretty hard to gain the trust of a community or the individuals you wish to have represented within your collections. On a base level, I think it's a matter of common decency and manners, but it's also basic humanity. It's relating to people. You have to try and put themselves in their shoes to try and anticipate their questions and their insecurities and their concerns, or if you're lucky, temper their enthusiasm. And this can be as applicable to those using your collections as well as, or in alignment to those you might be soliciting collections from. It's only in recent memory that most major archives and libraries have stopped asking for letters of introduction, and some still do. And if your archive does, that's not necessarily a problem, but you will be aware that that is a barrier for many. And the legacy of that practice is that many people, even those with postgraduate qualifications, feel that they don't have a place in archives. They don't have a right to be in that space. They feel that, you know, in any case, they're not sure who they would ask to get a letter of introduction, and therefore they won't get a reader's ticket, even if your service doesn't offer that. I still get asked about letters of introduction at work. And I think National Archives stopped asking for letters of introduction before I was born. So the legacy hangs on. Things don't change that much in some ways. You know, readers' tickets do present a barrier to some who are concerned that they need a reader's ticket if they want to do proper research. But I think we can all agree there are some checks and balances that simply cannot be worked around in the name of responsible custodianship. I work in leafy West London, home to the most dubious section of the District Line. And although I've worked at the National Archives for over 15 years now, it's taken me this long to stop being surprised that people for whom the world rarely presents barriers consider the leap over the threshold of our brutalist monstrosity of a building to be a step beyond them. Is it a surprise that people with less privilege, less experience in this world, don't believe that archives are a space that they are entitled to be in? I routinely encounter people, usually on the stairs for some reason, looking bewildered and unsure of where they should be headed. Despite our not insignificant signage, something about the staircase seems to induce a state of fear about where they should be headed. And on our inquiry desk, the standard opening phrase is, "I'm sorry to bother you." And I've taken to responding, "Please don't apologise. It's literally why I'm paid to be here. Please bother me." And I should note that it's rarely the people who start our interaction with like this who actually turn out to be the ones who are bothering me. Sometimes, and in part, because I'm the principal record specialist for family history, an individual will start to tell me the particular anecdote or family curiosity which has led them to come in to pursue their line of inquiry. And then they'll apologise for getting enthused about whatever it is they're telling me. And I have to try and reassure them that actually hearing what they've learnt or uncovered is sometimes the best part of my job. Community outreach is another crucial facet of this type of work, and this has the potential to be both time-consuming and complex, but also deeply rewarding. But it's critical to remember that you are working with people, and archiving is not something that should be done to people. But building a relationship with a group or an individual requires time and patience, when these are not necessarily always in great supply. And you also require a hefty dose of realism, because the likelihood is that you are going to have to start small, work hard, and build something slowly. As a profession, we have to shift and adapt, whether that's learning another language, literal or metaphorical, understanding a culture which may not be our own, and interpreting practice, explaining our own as much as anything, having the time and the funding to invest in opening doors, going out into a community, building that foundation is critical to ensuring that archives which are both realistic and representative continue to be collected, and both time and funding are ultimately finite resources. Funding for any type of archive work is central and key. Local authorities and national collections have some teeth through the limited scope of the Place of Deposit Scheme and the Local Government Act, and responsibilities under various other pieces of information legislation. And other archives may be fortunate enough to be well funded by their founder organisation or from another source, and these factors will inevitably impact the extent, scale, and relevance of how a service engages with its public. Some archives are in position to widen their impacts through making their collections online, through digital access, often but not exclusively through commercial partnerships, which is generally well received. When the 1921 census was released, initially on a pay-per-view model and then subsequently across a variety of subscriptions, including academic access, there was a lot of discussion in a variety of public forums about the cost and the cost of access. And we can have a lengthier conversation in another time and place about the pros and cons of such commercial suppliers, but there is something to be said for being able to access high-resolution digital images from the comfort of your own living room or other location of your choice for the price of less than a cup of coffee at any high street chain of cafes you may choose to name. I've had some absolute browbeatings from people who are firmly opposed to commercial partnerships for public archives, but without them, there often simply isn't the funding to bring collections the size of, for example, the 1921 census into a usable digital format without commercial partnership. The scale simply isn't in reach. The records of 38 million people noted on 100-year-old paper, both sides, with all the challenges of preservation as part of the process, plus the associated record series, is vast. And that paper cannot stand up to the level of demand for access were it provided in its original form. And researchers increasingly expect and demand keyword searchable, high-resolution digital images, and you can't have it both ways. And for all those people who say that archives should not go down a commercial pathway, that they should fund this type of work for themselves, I'm just going to observe that no one challenged on this viewpoint has ever been able to provide examples of their personal and extensive petitioning to the powers that be that any or indeed one single archive should be in receipt of more public funding for their work. I'll wait. This brings me on to the digital divide, which is not just about the cost of access. It's about the cost of owning a computer. It's about being able to pay for the extra electricity to run your computer in the day. If you're working on a weekly food budget of £1 a day per head, a subscription to anything is not going to be within your reach. But there's also a skills divide. For many of us, working in a hybrid world is now second nature. But there are also many people for whom computers, or indeed basic literacy, are a vast and immovable barrier. I assisted a gentleman just last week whose level of "I'm not very good with computers" translated into "I have never used a computer with a mouse." Let that sit with you for a while. Computers are not necessarily the future or the be-all and end-all of public engagement with archives for everyone. And that in and of itself also presents an opportunity. A burning desire to answer questions about the past, their past or someone else's, might just be the catalyst to encourage someone to learn new things. Utilising a computer in an archive might just be the way that someone improves their digital literacy and builds their confidence in new technology. Volunteer projects might give someone the chance to improve their familiarity with spreadsheets, for example, or develop a skill which can be utilised in another capacity. Recent volunteers on a project that I run on First World War nurses' records have been drawn from as wide a range as 15-year-old boys needing to do their volunteering section for their Bronze DV, through to a chap who's been recently released from prison and was looking for a project to improve his IT skills at his own pace in his own place of residence, I have students who wanted to keep their hand in with historical records over the summer. I have mothers of young children who love history and want to do something in the evenings when their toddlers are asleep that they can do, again, at their own time. And I have recently retired nurses who have taken the opportunity to do this project in an attempt not to throttle their husbands in the early months of retirement. You know, archives save lives, who knew? And who knew that 16,000 service records for women 100 years ago would have that broad an appeal? I didn't. But this is where building confidence comes in. The opportunity to upskill has potential for the future of engaging with archives. It's not always necessarily about the material itself, but the skills that you can learn when you're using it. It's as much about the lateral skills of how do I read this, what questions should I be asking, and what do I need to record, and why is that interesting as much as anything else? And that transcends age. My youngest volunteer is 15. My eldest is 87. They will have got different things from the engaging with this archive project, but that difference doesn't make it any less valuable. And I think there's something particularly powerful from that, building on engaging children and young people at archives, about showing them that people like them are in archives. I recently helped a young man called Matthew, who was 6 years old, whose mother was busily typing away on 1921, and Matthew was visibly quite bored. So I helped him find another Matthew, also 6, living in Kew in the 1921 census. And he trotted home with a copy of this schedule, absolutely delighted, planning to take it into school the next morning to show his friends that people like him lived in Kew 100 years ago. And I really hope that he remembers that and feels that down the line that he has the option, at least, to go into that archive and find out more things, to ask more questions. So there is this opportunity here to support people to develop and maintain key digital and documentary skills across the ages, and in supporting and facilitating them to work with original records, to give them the skills to work with archives with confidence, to never question their right to be in that building, doing that research, reading those documents just because they're interested, to know where to go to find the sources to support or challenge their knowledge and expectations of documentary material, to know their rights in the information landscape. But we also need to consider how we're teaching these skills, how they are available, where they can be learnt. Archivists are sometimes positioned as gatekeepers, and sometimes that's necessary, but again, has the potential to be a barrier. So it's important to consider how we share our skills and our knowledge, and how we make the most of these in the way that we interact with documents and with people. So there we are, that's my 2 penneth on the future of public engagement with archives. Build relationships, look wider, help people, find people like them in the collections one way or another, take opportunities to upskill people in a variety of ways and share your skills and cement the funding for your ambitions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessamy. It is so tempting to dive into questions immediately, but we're going to stick to the process we've agreed. Apart from me just giving a little advertisement to say, if you're under any doubt, the University Library at Cambridge is open to anyone 16 plus who wants a reader's ticket, and I do mean anyone. This is what our collections are for. So without further questions right now, we're going to come straight away to Dr. Mary Takayanagi, who is a senior archivist at the Parliamentary Archives with expertise in public services, exhibition and outreach. In 2018, Mary was the co-curator of the Parliamentary Vote 100 exhibition project, celebrating the centenary of the first women voters and MPs, something which we all, I think, felt very engaged with at the time. So I'm really looking forward, Mary, to hearing about you talk about the future of academic engagement and scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today, and the perspective that I am talking from is as both of an archivist and a historian. This is where I work. This is the home of the Parliamentary Archives. We hold the institutional records of the House of Commons and House of Lords. We also hold various political paper collections, similar to what are held in Churchill here, including the papers of David Lloyd George and other papers of the Beaverbrook Library after it needed a new home in the 1970s. The Lloyd George papers are our most heavily used collection. My background as an archivist is that I did a master's degree in archives and records management at the UCL in the late 90s, and then I worked at LSE Archives for 3 years before joining the Parliamentary Archives in 2000. I've worked in a wide variety of roles there over the years, but mainly in public services, as Jess has been describing, and outreach. And my background as a historian, After a few years in the Parliamentary Archives, I embarked on a history PhD as an opportunity to explore our collections in more depth, because I was fed up with constantly interpreting, explaining, making accessible to people and not having the chance to read them myself. I did my PhD part-time while working full-time between 2005 and 2012. I always say I wouldn't recommend that to anybody. And my subject was women in Parliament in the early 20th century. I've maintained a strong record of academic publication and speaking since, and was delighted to be elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society earlier this year. So, as an archivist and a historian, I find the relationship between the two really interesting. I've seen it described as symbiotic. One cannot survive without the other. And this was certainly echoed by all the papers at the conference yesterday and indeed this morning, where historians lined up, many here in this room I think, to praise archivists, particularly and justifiably the archivists here at Churchill Archive Centre. As Lord Boateng said yesterday, everyone here believes that history matters and archives matter. Alex Green argued for the need for historians to better understand the work of archivists and how archives are created. And from the archives side, Alan Packwood said yesterday, without our researchers, there's little point in keeping our archives. So, as someone with a foot on both sides of the fence, I would, of course, echo all such sentiments. And the longer I work as an archivist, the more I appreciate the need for historians and archivists to work together. And as someone who is both, I believe having someone able to perform both roles presents the best opportunity for archives to engage with academic research. Now, of course, it's not necessary for an archivist to have a PhD to do academic research or engage with academia. In my case, though, having a history PhD as well as being a professional archivist made me the expert voice required in Parliament and expected by stakeholders there for certain projects. We have about 45 staff in the Parliamentary Archives in various roles, and I'm the only one with a doctorate. It's given me empathy with academics for my public services work, understanding a position from both sides of the reading room desk, understanding how archives catalogues are constructed and how historians want to use them. It's also effectively made me the point person for academic partnerships within the office over the years. I have supervised collaborative PhDs, guest lectured parliamentary studies students, supported many academic funding bids with many universities, some successful and some not. But the most notable was the Vote 100 project, which marked 100 years of the first women voters and the first women MPs in 2018. The highlight of which you can see on the screen here was the Voice and Vote exhibition, a huge exhibition in the medieval Westminster Hall, which had 107,000 visits. I was a joint project manager and co-curator for this, working with Melanie Unwin, Deputy Curator of Works of Art in Parliament. I was able to be the in-house historical expert for this exhibition and related projects without Parliament having to buy this in or bring it in any other way. More broadly, my PhD research and subsequent research meant I knew everybody in this area. I built up my own network of women's historians over the previous decade. Vote 100 provided huge additional value through academic partnerships with 6 universities, York, Lincoln, Plymouth, Warwick, Royal Holloway and Reading, and the History of Parliament Trust. These partnerships included 2 £100,000 AHRC-funded projects and a collaborative PhD. I could say more about Vote 100, but as it was a few years ago now, for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to draw on my more recent experiences researching and writing Necessary Women, the Untold Story of Parliament's Working Women, which you can see in front of me here and on the screen. This is my first book, published 2 months ago, and like Vote 100, a collaborative piece of work, co-authored with Dr. Elizabeth Hallam-Smith. Now, Liz is another archivist and historian. Some of you may recognise her name because she was Director of Public Services at the National Archives for many years, and then House of Lords Librarian and Director of Information Services for 10 years. Necessary Women tells the stories of notable but forgotten women workers of Parliament from around 1800 to 1960. And although a trade book, and therefore affordable, it is impeccably grounded in academic research with full endnotes and sources. Our archive sources include institutional records, personal papers, family history records, visual and spatial sources, including works of art and plans, and oral histories. I believe our archival training and experience combine perfectly with our historical knowledge and expertise to write these stories. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about 3 stories in the book which were particularly powerfully supported by archive documents. These 3 are Jane, Goddess of Bellamy's, Kay Midwinter, the first woman clerk in the House of Commons, and Elizabeth Ross-Poyser, the first woman archivist in the Lords. And then I'll return to what this means, what being both a historian and an archivist may mean in terms of future academic research and engagement. So, first of all, Jane, Goddess of Bellamy's. In 1835, Charles Dickens, the author, writing as Boz, wrote a parliamentary sketch which immortalised the staff of Bellamy's refreshment rooms in the House of Commons. These included Jane, the chief cook and waitress. Now, Jane was a pseudonym, and new archival research by Liz for Necessary Women identified her as Elizabeth Faville, later Elizabeth Burton. Liz pieced her story together from various archival sources, including this badly burned book. This remarkable survival is an account book for Bellamy's. Its pages itemise payments to suppliers and staff year by year from 1813 and ending abruptly in 1834 when a great fire burned down the medieval Houses of Parliament and Bellamy's 6 resident staff had to flee their premises to escape the inferno. The Bellamy's valued their staff and kept meticulous records. This burned book, one of very few House of Commons records to survive the 1834 fire, shows her name recurring at the top of lists of wages. Jane remained a legendary figure in Parliament until Bellamy's closed down in 1852 and beyond. She lived out her life in the Westminster area and died in 1862. I'm now going to jump forward in time to the Second World War, perhaps a little bit more close to some of the stories we've heard about here at this conference. In April 1940, Kate Midwinter was appointed the first female clerk in the House of Commons to free up a man for war service. I should explain perhaps that clerks support the work of the chamber and committees. They are the top rung of workers in Parliament and not at the bottom, as one might assume. The girl clerk, as she was termed in the press, she was aged 32, worked for the National Expenditure Committee, and previous experience working at the League of Nations in Geneva helped her get the job. Now, I particularly wanted to mention her at this conference because she was, of course, there while Winston Churchill was Prime Minister. Later in life, Midwinter did an oral history recording for the United Nations archive at the Bodleian Library, Oxford, so I got to hear her own voice on a tape there, which was very exciting. Now, she reflected on her time in the Commons as follows. So this is a quote. During the war, I was standing behind the Speaker's chair about 5 or 6 yards from Churchill while he made all his famous war speeches. He used to glare at me as much as to say, "What's this woman doing?" But he never challenged me. I was expecting to be ordered to be removed from the chamber, but it was great fun. And then when it came to laying the report on the table of the House, my male colleagues said, "Oh, you'd better not do that. It's never been done by a woman before." So I said, "Well, for that reason, I'm going to do it." So there we are. But really, one was up against male prejudice throughout. Absolutely. There was never any question of promotion. End of quote. Not only promotion, but pay, because as this document in the Parliamentary Archive shows, Midwinter was paid less than half the rate of her fellow male clerks doing exactly the same job as her. After complaints by female MPs, she received a pay rise, although only to the woman's equivalent. You might be able to see sort of fourth line up from the bottom there, the woman's equivalent of the male grade, not equal pay. After the war, she went to work for the United Nations for the rest of her life, first in New York and then back in Geneva, where she died in 1996. For my third and final necessary woman, I'm going to bring things back to archives with Elizabeth Ross Poyser, Assistant Clerk of the Records in the House of Lords Record Office, which is the former name for the Parliamentary Archives, from 1950 to 1965. She was second in command to Maurice Bond, Clerk of the Records, and a bit of a legendary figure in the post-Second World War archives profession. Poyser was previously a history research student at Newnham College here in Cambridge, and I was particularly intrigued to discover in the archives that the reason for the Lords appointing a records girl, as she was termed in the press, was that Maurice Bond set out to recruit a woman. He wrote to the Public Record Office, now the National Archives, and the Institute of Historical Research to ask them to recommend female candidates. He interviewed 6 women, and Poyser got the job. The role was to run the public search room, prepare records for microfilming, list acts of Parliament, box and index the parchment collection, and more. Very similar to an archivist job today, except without the modern technology. The records do not explain why Bond wanted a woman. It may have been in part that she would be cheaper to employ, this was before equal pay came in, and he would have expected a reasonable pool of candidates. In 1965, Poyser went to work at the Westminster Diocesan Archives, the first female lay archivist employed by the Catholic Church, so another pioneering role. She retired in 1989 and died in 2010. I never met her, but I'm grateful for her part in preserving and making accessible the records that I now look after and research myself. So, in conclusion, as I hope these little sort of bits from my book have shown you, as a piece of rigorous historical research, grounded in archives, and written in an accessible way for a general audience, Necessary Women reframes the Houses of Parliament to give a new perspective into it as a social space and a workspace for people other than MPs and peers. As such, it is an important contribution to scholarships, and I have had 7 conference papers on it accepted this year, 5 down, 2 to go, and not including this one. The insight it brings is enormously enriched by the experiences that Liz and I were able to bring as archivists and experts in collections held inside and outside Parliament. As an archivist, it has also provided benefit, as I've been able to feature a number of the archive documents in this display in the Royal Gallery in the House of Lords. The display and the book have helped bring the parliamentary archives to the attention of new audiences, particularly women staff in Parliament who had no idea about their predecessors. And thinking about the future as both historian and archivist, I have my eye as to what may happen in 2028. This is the anniversary, the centenary of the Equal Franchise Act of 1928, which gave women the parliamentary vote on the same terms as men without age or property restrictions, which makes it the true suffrage centenary. I think this is a great equality anniversary opportunity for archivists and historians, and a lot of things could be hung on this. 2018 was big, but 2028 ought to be bigger. I have been maintaining the UK Vote 100 social media account set up for 2018 in the hope they may be useful in 2028. And now, more specifically, I am advisor for commemorating the Equal Franchise Act 1928, which is a technically funded collaborative PhD with Royal Holloway and the National Archives, and starts this autumn. In fact, I think the student may have already started now. The student will research the Equal Franchise Act and its impact on society. And she is a museums professional by background, which may be incredibly helpful because this is not just a standard PhD, it's a PhD by practice in public history. So this means that she will be expected to produce research-driven public history outputs for 2028, as well as a thesis. These outputs might include physical or digital exhibitions, blogs, podcasts, and so on. But whatever they are, they will be grounded in her own academic scholarship, hopefully in a similar way to my previous efforts. We've yet to see how this pans out, but as a historian archivist, I hope that this kind of PhD might be a model for future academic engagement with archives, and I hope that 2028 will be a key date for planning for other archives across the UK, including Churchill. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary, and it was wonderful to see again those images from Parliament for the Archives in Action, Voice and Vote for Women in Parliament. And I, for one, have been scribbling down 2028 to make sure we're not missing it in our own practice too, so thank you so much. We're going to come for our last speaker to Dr. Chris Woods. Dr. Chris Woods is joining us on the screen. He is the director of a UK non-profit membership organisation for archives, libraries and museums called the National Conservation Service. He's also had many former roles in the public sector, including as head of preservation at the Bodleian and also the director of collection services for the Tate. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to have the opportunity to talk. I'm honoured. I'm also honoured because I've been ennobled with a doctorate, which I don't have. But I'm not sure that matters too much in this context. I'm going to read this off my screen, so you might see me looking a bit glazed, and I don't have more than a couple of pictures for you, so I hope you don't find it too tedious seeing me blather on. My broad topic is sustainability in the context of the conservation of archives. And I use the word conservation in its broadest sense. Other people call it preservation, collection care, and so forth. I've spoken and written about the concept of sustainable storage more widely, and I'll touch on features today, but it's a large topic. So I've chosen to focus today on one challenge we face in ensuring collections are conserved. I've identified 4 questions that are linked and which reveal a challenge for our sector that I'll describe in more detail. And the questions are, how do we protect and conserve collections for generations to come in safe and sustainable stores? What is it that collections need in order for us to achieve sustainable conservation? What messages about this do we need to convey to others? And how do we convince others that we have the knowledge and expertise to specify what it is that collections need? So why do I think these are important questions? Evidence from archives all over the UK for the last 50 years has shown us that mechanical control systems in stores, that is, air conditioning systems, if you like, can and do place collections at risk, as well as cost money and energy to install and to run. The concepts of sustainable conservation storage, which I and others have set out in recent times, conflict with other professions' understanding of what it takes to provide a suitable storage climate. We have, in part, ourselves to blame for this misunderstanding. Since the first iteration of the British Standard 5454 back in 1978, our sector has set out the notion that a safe storage can only be achieved by managing the air passing through a store and providing constant ventilation. We accepted the ideas of mechanical engineers that if archives were safe in a stable relative humidity, or RH, and a stable temperature, the only way to do this was to run air conditioning systems, controlling to our agreed set points, such as 50% plus or minus 5% RH, and 18 degrees Celsius plus or minus 1 degree. The misjudgment in this thinking is not that stable daily conditions are not good for collections, they are, but that those stable conditions can only be achieved by mechanical systems. The truth is that stability can be achieved by packaging collections and placing them in a good building structure, that is, by achieving airtightness and good insulation. Furthermore, we told those people who sought to know what we needed that archives produce pollutants that damage themselves, so we needed fresh air in the ventilation. And we told them that air needed to be moving fast around our usually boxed archives, otherwise there would be pockets of high RH that would cause them to go mouldy. It is the case that many archives in the mid-20th century were being placed in unsuitable damp basements. But this wasn't new, and Charles Dickens will pop up here again, Murray, I apologise for that. In Tale of Two Cities, he talks in 1859 of the records in a banking house with the following words: "Your deeds got into extemporised strong rooms made of kitchens and sculleries and fretted all the fat out of their parchments into the banking house air." The key words here, in my view, are extemporised strong rooms. Archives were so often seen as things we unfortunately had to keep, but providing space for them in otherwise more useful locations was not convenient. So they were given spaces that were essentially ones that no one else wanted to use. County hall or college basements, where in some cases still are, the most common places where these inconvenient collections were so often stored. Wind forward to the 1970s, and mechanical air conditioning systems were becoming common. When improvements were sought or new buildings planned, it was believed that using air systems to control qualities of the air in a strong room would be the answer to conserving collections. Sadly, these systems have turned out often to be a curse. In talking with archivists in many dozens of locations over the past 35 years, the most common, almost universal plaint I've heard is that such systems were installed, they regularly failed, that parts needed to fix them were always long awaited, and in most cases the fans continued running, driving enormous volumes of often moist air through the stores, resulting in mould outbreaks that damaged collections. And when they broke down completely or had to be switched off, the inadequacies of the buildings themselves caused further risk. Damp walls were not being dried out by fast-moving air. Hot water pipes running through them were not being cooled, perversely, by cool air. And damp, fresh air, otherwise prevented from entering by the air pressure of the mechanical systems pushing out, would continuously infiltrate. In other locations, extreme dryness was the result of running systems whose humidification mechanism constantly failed, allowing warmth of extraneous heating to steadily desiccate the collections. By the last iteration of BS 5454 in 2000, the reliance on mechanical systems was such that almost no one in the archive community recognised that there were other ways of achieving a safe environment, and that archives as materials needed a different strategy. Much of the conservation science around the actual physical properties of archival collections was published in the 1990s, but so few actually read the research, let alone put two and two together. The research was demonstrating that archival materials did not behave the way that the engineering models assumed. RH stability could be achieved by packaging and by ensuring the walls, floors, and ceilings were not letting in water or open to the air outside. But by this time, mechanical systems were being controlled by increasingly sophisticated computer software, and the only people trusted to understand how to provide a suitable storage environment were mechanical engineers. On the face of it, you may say, well, as long as they can be trusted to come up with the right package, we needn't worry. But they consistently fail to do so. The reason? Because they and we collectively fail to understand how archival materials and stores filled with them actually behave. The focus was always on the equipment and the air quality. To set the record straight now, paper, parchment, leather and textiles do not gas off pollutants harmful to themselves. Indeed, if they did, we've been failing them by recommending for decades that they be stored inside envelopes, folders and boxes where they would stew in their own juices. And further, mould grows in windy places. Moving air through archives does not stop mould growing if, for example, the air blowing through has a high RH because the mechanical systems are failing. And even if the aggregate of fresh air is a lower RH, the air still carries moisture, and that moisture is absorbed by the collections. So what do we need to say to those that are briefed to provide good stores? That we need well-sealed structures, sealed against water and air, and natural cooling through waterproof but uninsulated floor slabs in contact with the earth. We need no extraneous water pipes, and we need a good level of insulation against external temperature changes, including against heated offices next door. With a dry collection, that is archives equilibrated to around 40 to 50% RH, inside this well-insulated and fairly airtight space, the collections will remain at a safe moisture content, and the RH of the air around them will be dictated by that moisture content. The moisture content of archives is the key to understanding a safe storage environment. The assumptions design engineers make about RH and its behaviour in a well-sealed store are, when we receive reports from them, wholly inaccurate and based on the air rather than the objects. The modelling software they use cannot model a filled archive store, so they model the RH patterns outside the buildings, which is nonsense. For example, see these graphs. Now I'm going to share my screen with a couple of pictures. You'll bear with me. Okay, so you should be able to see just a graph on the screen, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Great, thank you. This is a graph an engineer would understand. An electromechanical sensor sitting in a corner of a room records that the temperature, the red line, has gone up. And so it recalculates the RH value, the blue line, as being lower. It is, after all, a mathematical calculation that says the temperature of the air is X degrees, therefore its capacity to hold water is Y millimeters when at its maximum saturation. And the amount of moisture it's detected, which is lower, means the air is holding Z% of its total capacity. If the temperature of the air rises, its capacity to hold moisture increases. So the moisture it is holding is less of a proportion of its new capacity. So the RH figure is calculated downwards. This is the basis of engineering modelling. But it isn't reality in an enclosed space such as a room or a box filled with archives. Here's a reading from inside a box in precisely the same location as the first. Now, you should be able to see this graph. You'll see that the red line, the temperature, goes down RH has gone down slightly with it. It goes up again. The RH, the blue line, goes up with it. Temperature comes down, RH comes down. So it's completely the opposite of what the typical mechanical sensor model shows us. Now, this may seem a small and arcane point, but it exemplifies our misunderstanding of how archives behave, and therefore what they need in order to be safe from mould or extreme dryness. An archive collection holds massively more embodied water than in the tiny amounts of water in the free air of the room. The archives absorb moisture if it's added to the room, but if it's not added, then they will maintain the same moisture content until the temperature changes. When it warms up, they release air into the space around them, and when they cool down, they absorb that moisture again. This means a well-sealed room that doesn't have a constant blast of air passing through it from outside will contain the same amount of moisture embodied in the archives indefinitely. The room RH will go up slightly as the temperature rises over the seasons and come down again as it cools. So, what's the challenge that we face then? Across the UK, we've been told by building managers when reviewing existing stores and by architects when planning new buildings that the experts in environmental control are mechanical engineers. Consistently, archivists face an uphill struggle asking managers to listen to them and not to engineers. Money is spent on redesigns of equipment instead of improvements to building surfaces. These improvements can be cheaper than installing or replacing full-scale air handling units, and they save millions over time by not requiring constant energy and maintenance contracts. But building managers still ignore what archivists tell them because they are not deemed the experts. We have, if we ever had it, lost the authority that ensures that others who are not working in archives and libraries defer to all of us that are when it comes to how our collections should be stored. I could make a further sociological point, that the building management sector is dominated by men, and most archivists and special collection librarians are women. Time and again, I've listened to archivists tell me that they are dismissed, ignored, and patronised. That particular cause of our loss of authority can't be recent, however, and in theory it ought to be getting better, albeit very slowly in my experience. It is better now in new building programmes than in refurbishments, probably because more and more architects are women and an increasing number of engineers also. But in the field of improvements to existing buildings, under the auspices of senior estates managers, archivists continue to struggle to make themselves heard or be believed when they challenge the dominating views of estate departments and large engineering contractors. As one of so many examples, in a fairly recent review still underway, one building manager whose estates included a county archive in the Midlands ignored the archivist, called in an expert from the Building Research Establishment in 2021 to review the passive archive building and recommend improvements. Well, fair enough, you might say. BRE are recognised as building experts, archivists are not. But that BRE expert then wrote a report solely premised on all of the now debunked myths of BS 5454 and cited it as the standard to follow. BS 5454 was withdrawn in 2012, being under review then, and the standard which replaced much of it for environment, BS 4971, was published in 2017. Archivists in the UK know that. A building expert would not. The issue here is simply that we as a sector are not considered the recognised experts in what archives require in order to be well conserved. And one of the reasons for that is for too long, the focus has been on the mechanical means of managing environment and not on the nature and materials of archives. Archive buildings are estates assets. They have ceased to be thought of as places where historic archival objects are preserved. Where mechanical systems are not working properly, the concern for the building manager is which contractor is he allowed to use and how much will it cost, not what will happen to the archives while the systems are failing. We have a big challenge ahead of us, that of managing the long-term conservation of collections in an overheating world. To address that, we must also try to address the challenge of why we no longer have the authority to protect collections as we know we must. So what do we need to do? We need to find ways of convincing others that we should be listened to. Building sector people must be persuaded to hear what we're saying and be led by us when defining what is best for our collections. To begin to achieve this, we need leadership from all parts of our profession, and particularly from the most senior. The only way our roles will be vested with authority is by taking the time to learn and understand what our collections need and demand of others that they defer to us when that knowledge is required. We must take back ownership of our area of knowledge. We gave it away during the era of 5454, and the waste of money and energy has been colossal. And worse, our collections have in so many places suffered at the same time. The answer lies in building design that meets the needs of the collections they hold. And this means greatly reducing cost, energy use and carbon emissions, so seeking this goal is entirely consistent with our wider conservation objectives. I'll finish with a question. If you're responsible for a library or archive, ask yourself this. If a member of the public found out your collections were in a really bad condition, would they automatically just say, "Oh, poor dear, she must have a terrible maintenance engineer"? Or would they wonder if it reflects on your professionalism as an archive manager? We are too often in a situation of having responsibility without authority, and this has to change if we're to sustain our archive.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, I'm delighted that Churchill has honoured you with an honorary doctorate by virtue of a printed programme and the lettering there. So I'm very pleased you're on that. But more seriously, thank you for such a sobering provocation. And I am sure that this being Churchill, there is more than one engineer in the room. So that may lead to an interesting discussion as we go forward. I am tempted as ever to just dive in with questions of my own because they're running through my head, but I am going to be a good chair and hold myself back and see what we might have from our audience first. Is there anyone who'd like to start us off exploring these challenges that you've heard in facing the future of our archives profession, our storage, our access? Thank you. If you just wait for the microphone, if you don't mind. Thank you.
David Wallace, I apologise that this is a question to Alan Packwood. Where are you after Chris's talk? Where at the Archive Centre after?
I mean, this is exactly why we wanted to have this session and why we wanted to have Chris on the screen. Because as some of the people in this room will be aware, both Archive Centre team members and members of our Archives Committee, these are exactly the sorts of issues that we're starting to look at as a team. We are quite unhappy at the moment about the ongoing use of our existing air conditioning system for really all of the reasons that Chris has given. So we've already started to work with a consultant about how we might be able to mitigate that, but that's going to be very difficult within the constraints of the existing building. So we are also looking to the future and starting to think about, as the Archive Centre continues to expand, how we can avoid some of the mistakes of the past and ensure that we're now meeting the right standards in terms of sustainability, which is why I think it's great that several members of the Estates Committee and the Archives Committee are here today to see this presentation.
You'd think you'd have arranged a programme specially, Alan, but and actually I think it's great to have Alan talk, and I think you should feel free to come in on other questions as well, because this is about the future of the Archive Centre. While we're waiting for other hands to come up, I would really like to ask all of our panellists, you've set each of you out a particular area of challenge, from whose stories we're telling, from equitable access to the sustainable futures and climate change. And I'd be really interested in each of you, what are the opportunities that you see that come from those points of provocation in terms of continuing to be the powerful and important profession and place in the making of history and telling our stories that archives can and should be. I don't know who might be willing to kick off.
Thanks, Mara. Thanks, Mara. There absolutely are opportunities, and I think actually one of the real pros of having digital resources in particular is getting people started with their research. It's something they can do potentially in a space they feel very comfortable in. They can build their confidence, they can build their skills, and then they come into the archive and want to know more about a particular thing. Perhaps it's because they're researching their family in the area of a country that they're not that familiar with, so they want to look at the street maps, or they want to look at the National Farm Survey, or the valuation of that kind of. So that opportunity to kind of to widen out from where they're started, I think, is a really interesting one, and certainly one that we're increasingly seeing at Kew. And we saw it in the centenary with the First World War. Mari talked about Vote 100, and that was also interesting for us. But the First World War, I think, the centenary was a real game changer, because it suddenly allowed people who didn't have letters before and after their names to be experts. You had people who knew every single detail about their street in the First World War, or their village, or their institution, and their voice was as valid in the conversation as anyone else with. And that was quite empowering. That gave people the confidence to come in and do more research, to write books and articles and give conference papers and that sort of thing. I think being able to build on that is a real opportunity.
And that is how the archive gets richer as well, isn't it? As you broaden who is using the archive, or who the archive is for, the stories themselves should get richer and a greater different possibilities, more diverse history to be told. Mary?
Yes, so I sort of ended with 2028 as a great opportunity. It's only 5 years away, which of course is nothing in terms of planning. And since we're here to discuss the future, my understanding, and those of you who are academics in the room will know this better than me, is that there is always pressure to apply for grants, to get grants, and that outreach, engagement, knowledge exchange and so on is crucial to getting money. Those drivers may or may not change. But partnering with archives, or indeed other cultural heritage institutions, is the way to get that bit of what's required. So much as I sometimes feel that we're rather straitjacketed by anniversaries and celebrating this, that, and the other anniversary, but there's no denying it's what people are interested in, sort of wider public, and I suspect funders and so on as well. That everybody loves an anniversary, and particularly everybody loves a centenary. I could have given a completely different talk today about what happened in 2018, not just in Parliament, but across the country with Vote 100 and allied projects. And I do think that what was missing then, which would be really good if people could start thinking about for 2028, is some sort of network to be formed, sort of, and some sort of leadership, which could perfectly well come from a university, and in fact would probably best come from a university that got some sort of project grant behind it. Because what happened come back in 1918 is the government announced a big centenary fund with only a year out, and then the sort of criteria for it was only published literally in January 2018, with the actual anniversary in February 2018. And there was a need sort of earlier on for pressure on politicians, for people to be talking together and working together more. In order that these things could have been set out sooner. And I kind of hope that we can learn some of those lessons. And yeah, anybody out there listening to this, I'm always very happy to talk to anyone about that sort of thing.
Thank you so much, Mary. I mean, that sort of the short-term planning, the short-term nature of funding is a real challenge, isn't it, for us all in terms of the long-term game which we all are in. Which brings me to Chris. I mean, you ended with a provocation there, Chris. Do you want to say a bit more about what the opportunities are ahead for us in terms of trying to achieve the kind of sustainability that you've hinted at?
Sure, thank you. Well, aside from the obvious, which is that, strictly speaking, our archives will last longer if we look after them in better ways. But there's another area that I found quite common. I'm involved in about 40 to 50 building refurb and new building design schemes at the moment across the UK. There's always a lot of switch-off projects happening. So we're looking at switching off air conditioning systems and finding out what the building, how it performs, and then suggesting adjustments that might need to be made to the building, invariably, in order to provide a passive, climate stable store. And in those circumstances, what I find commonly is the case is that the archives suddenly pops up within other parts of, say, a local authority or a university as being a focus of sustainability in the wider energy context. And, you know, you can save so much money and reduce your carbon footprint significantly, as well as take away a significant risk to collections by not having those systems and or not running them all the time. And I've had archivists tell me how positive their situation projected itself to be amongst those divisions within, say, a local authority that are focusing on how will this authority meet its net zero targets or its carbon reduction targets. One particular dance company archive the other day, I've been working with the archivists with their switch off program, and the chief exec of the dance company told the archivist, who was by now very much in her good books, that having learned that they could run their archive without running air conditioning all the time, she said that this was the best news she'd heard all year. Well, that's an extraordinary thing. I hope it doesn't reflect on what her normal life is like. But you know, I could see that what was good there is that the archivist was suddenly seen as someone who had a corporate goal, not just a local segment goal, if you like. So there are definitely opportunities for the profession more widely and obviously for our services.
Thank you, Chris. As someone who's just embarking on an architectural master plan for the University Library, this could not be more timely. Thank you so much. Is there no further question from the audience? Thank you. Actually, this is an engineer at the back, I should tell you, Chris. But...
I'm Trevor Cave. I did engineering here in 1971 to 74, and I'm reminded of Shostakovich's comment about a creative reply to just criticism. The kind of discussion we've had from Chris really made me sit up and think. And believe me, I have seen parallel situations in many times in industry where people did not capture the requirement properly. That there are people who they call solutioneers and people who want to productize and impose a technical solution because it's superficially quick and easy and they don't really think about what's going on. I did, however, spend 2 years as a requirements manager. And the last thing you want to specify is detailed items of technology, and even the performance is not the first thing you specify. I'll be delighted to talk to Alan or anybody else about the correct process of requirements capture, because I've seen people get it terribly wrong and come up with mutually self-defeating contradictory requirements, unachievable requirements, because one precludes the other and vice versa. It can be done, and particularly with the knowledge that you archive people have, I'm sure we can do it quite effectively, and I'd be delighted to take part in the conversation.
Thank you. That's really, really kind of you, and I think several of us will be coming back to your door as well as to Chris's. Is there a further question from the floor? Richard.
Hi, it's Richard Ovenden. It's actually a question for Mary, which is about how much do the parliamentarians themselves learn from the wonderful work that you're doing, and how much do they absorb and perhaps even, think about it in terms of their policy making or their legislative activity?
Much as I would love to say that they come and use us all the time, they absolutely don't, I'm afraid. There are, of course, some MPs and peers who are individually very interested in history, or indeed historians themselves, who have visited us, very few who have used our collections, and more who have come on tours and show interest. But we are mainly here for the public, and our usership is a large proportion of academics, quite a lot of lawyers, and then a small amount of family historians, local historians, as is more typical for the National Archives. And we do have internal users, though, but they're more staff, staff of the Commons and staff of the Lords, looking back at their own precedents and previous committees and that kind of thing. So it does inform their work, and therefore, I suppose, indirectly the MPs. But the members, of course, have libraries. So the House of Commons Library, House of Lords Library, both excellent institutions, and they're there to provide briefings for any member that wants them. And those staff will come and use this if they have to. So maybe it's just a couple of steps away.
Thank you, Mary and Richard. Perhaps I can ask a closing question then. I was lucky enough to be here for dinner last night and was sat with a number of the historians who were talking about the 1980s. Those of you who were here yesterday would have been part of those conversations. And most of them were scratching their heads and worrying if they were looking at a later period, one dominated by digital archives rather than physical, what would they be doing? And that is one challenge which we've sort of skirted, apart from, Jessamy, you talking about the real issues of digital poverty, which are important locally as well as globally in terms of access to what we hold. What about that challenge of future access to the archives? I wonder if each of you might just comment briefly on that.
I think the 1980s is a really interesting period from a technical point of view because it's hybrid. And the issue is less when everything is all paper or all digital, because those are relatively straightforward to put mechanisms in place to prevent obsolescence. But it's when you have the beginnings of things and the stuff people try. So I know, for example, within the court service, most of the records held on those servers were standalone. And it's not 100% clear what's happened to all of those. I know that some courts have retained all of those original computers and therefore the records are accessible for that. I know that others have printed them all out on that green paper that used to have dots down the side. I used to do colouring on it in my mum's office when I was a kid. But that fades like anything under sunlight. So there's as much risk to those, we've only got printouts of it, as there is to anything that's been created digitally. And in some ways, we're more aware of the challenges that digital technology presents because we've been worrying about it for longer. But it's that midpoint when paper is in poor supply or is of poor quality, when it is presented as the only surviving record, that it's particularly challenging. But I think obviously as our own technical nous improves, hopefully we will have better solutions which will allow us to go back and access those records. But it's the kind of, and I think actually within wider government, if you look at what's coming in, we already hold papers from the Blair administration. Now that the 30-year rule has been reduced down to 20 for some material, and you can see those kind of annotations, and it's as you lose that kind of paper-centric practice within offices and departments, I think that changes the nature of the way that we see government historically, because you lose those kind of snarky remarks from the Prime Minister on their memos and that kind of thing.
Thank you. Mary.
Yes, I mean, this is a whole subject in itself. It could have been a whole conference onto itself, really. We have a digital repository, something like 13 terabytes of digital data, some of which is digitised material of paper documents and some of which is born digital. And increasingly, of course, new records coming in are born digital. But this is something that's very much changed over the last 20 years. So when I started working in the Parliamentary Archives in 2000, we got as many letters as emails by inquiries, I mean. And of course that's changed year by year, and now we get a letter once a year, and everyone else emails or contacts us via some other way. I think I would echo what Jessamy has said, that it's actually it's that crossover situation that we've had sort of information and document management systems in Parliament for a while now, and I'm guessing the same is true of a lot of other institutions. And then there's some structures and mechanisms by which you can transfer whatever you need to a digital repository, hopefully, and then manage it properly. But that period before, where we had a print-to-paper policy for many years, quite if it did all get printed and filed or not, I think it could be a problem for the future. The other aspect of this, of course, is the WhatsApp, government or indeed Parliament by WhatsApp, which is a whole other set of issues. And when I show people, the oldest document we have in the Parliamentary Archives is in 1497, and I'd like to show people it and say, you might not be able to read the handwriting very easily, but it is beautifully legible 500 years on. Whereas, do you think your Word document will be, you'll be able to open it in 5 years or 50 years, let alone 500 years? And then that always makes people think.
Thank you. And Chris, I've heard sort of a brief answer, if I can come to you for that. Sure,
yeah. Well, I'll perhaps take an angle of it. the value of digital access, it seems to me, is the most important future feature as it affects the conservation of analogue material, because nobody in the late 21st century will want to travel to a reading room. I know it sounds, perhaps not something we want to hear, but, as we move increasingly towards a greater accessibility wherever you are in the world through digital media, and we get to a situation where the cost of looking after our analogue materials becomes such that we need to aggregate collections in optimum locations in a heating world. We move away from having collections sitting right next to reading rooms and requiring everyone to come to them. And of course, the digital angle on that is our great opportunity. It allows us to make that real as well as reach far more people, in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I hope, Alan, that's given you enough of a provocation for the next bit of thinking and also set up our last speaker as well. We have heard over the last couple of days several collective nouns for librarians, archivists, and now conservators, variously shushes and catalogues. I would just like to leave you with the note that we are, in fact, an inspiration, and that is how you should think of us. So please join me in saying thank you to Chris, to Mary, and to Jessamy.